So, there's your extremely tenuous tie between this episode and Jack the Ripper. Hello, and welcome to Frasier Fridays, where all the salads are tossed and all the eggs are scrambled. Today, we're looking at an exceptionally heavy episode of Frasier entitled Beloved Infidel. We're back to production numbers lining up with episode numbers here with episode 8 and production code number 108. Beloved Infidel originally aired November 4th, 1993, and attracted 27.1 million viewers, a climb of just 100,000 viewers from the prior week. Interestingly, we have the exact same growth for Seinfeld week over week. The two graphs bear quite a few similarities, now that Frasier has leveled out, and with the exception of the harsh drop on episode 6, it's following a similar trajectory to Seinfeld. Andy Ackerman returns for direction this episode, and writing duties fall to Leslie Eberhard. This is the first of only 2 episodes Eberhard will write. Like Brad Hall in episode 5, this episode's plotline is largely Martin-centric, and our writer is not someone I would have picked to write an episode for the Cheers spin-off. As a writer, Eberhard didn't have much TV writing experience prior to this, and the experience he did have on television was not critically acclaimed. Although I suspect that may have stemmed more from the concepts he worked on rather than his writing. Eberhard's first television writing gig was in 1987. Prior to that, he was actually best known as a Broadway writer. He wrote 4 different Broadway productions, All Dressed Up, Hey Ma, Kay Ballard, Jolson, and a Jekyll and Hyde musical called simply Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. For me, Jekyll and Hyde is by far the most interesting one on this list. It is far from the first stage production of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and it wasn't even a very successful one. I was only able to confirm 3 regional theaters putting on productions of it. And there was another musical version of the story that was much more successful by Frank Wildhorn that premiered in 1990. This isn't the part I found interesting enough I wanted to talk about. What I found interesting is the original stage version of Jekyll and Hyde premiered in 1887 and starred a man named Richard Mansfield. Now, here's where things get wild. The show went on a 20-year traveling route, with stops in London during the Jack the Ripper killings. They ended up cutting their engagement there short because some of the audience members were so frightened and convinced by Mansfield's transformation into Mr. Hyde that they thought he was really capable of murder, and at least one accusation of his being Jack the Ripper was leveled at him. So, there's your extremely tenuous tie between this episode and Jack the Ripper. Given this background, when Eberhard broke into television in 1987, it seems extremely appropriate it was to write 4 episodes for the 9 to 5 television series, starring Dolly Parton's sister Rachel. After that, he wrote 2 episodes of the 90s Munsters revival, The Munsters Today, which actually ran for 3 more episodes than the original Munsters series, and featured an all-new cast as the Munsters were transported from 1966 to the present of 1988. After that, he pitched a show called What a Dummy. This is a show I wasn't at all familiar with, and I don't think I need to be. Eberhard was heavily involved in this one-season sitcom about a living ventriloquist dummy who moved in with a suburban family. From what I understand, it was kind of like Alf, but with a ventriloquist dummy. It also starred a very young Stephen Dorff, aka Deacon Frost from Blade. It wasn't well received. After this, Eberhard wrote a few odd episodes of television here and there, including our 2 episodes of Frasier, before he wrote 14 episodes of the Saved by the Bell spinoff, The New Class, which, by the way, ran for 7 seasons. Eberhard's final major job before his death in 2002 was as one of the creators of the teen sitcom USA High. As the title implies, the show took place in a high school and was much in the same vein as Saved by the Bell. The first season ran for a whopping 75 episodes, while the second season only ran for 20. Despite his odd repertoire of writing, Eberhard did a good job with this episode, especially given its tricky subject matter. And I can't help but wonder under different circumstances if his career would have gone in a more drama-focused direction. This episode starts out with a blinking red light on top of the Space Needle. I'm guessing that means we're back in our original pattern, and we'll get a nothing happening intro for episode 14. As is becoming a common episode opener, we start with our guest caller scene. Unlike many of the previous episodes, this one doesn't really have anything to do with the plotline, and it doesn't instigate anything. The guest caller this episode is Jo Beth Williams, playing a woman named Danielle, who Dr. Crane can't understand. Williams is one of our certified movie star guest callers. She is probably best known for her role in Poltergeist and Poltergeist 2 as Diana Freeling. Poltergeist is a horror franchise I'm not overly familiar with, but I am familiar with another of Williams' starring roles. In the 1980 Gene Wilder, Richard Pryor comedy Stir Crazy, she played a woman named Meredith and Wilder's love interest. Obviously, the comedy duo is the main attraction here, but Williams does a fine job with her role in the film. A bit of a rabbit trail here, but for my money, the best of the Wilder Pryor comedies was See No Evil, Hear No Evil, where Wilder plays a deaf man and Pryor plays a blind man. Following this guest spot on Frasier, Williams will actually guest star in 2 episodes next season, as a woman named Madeline. It's a 2-parter, and I'm guessing she's going to be a love interest for Frasier. Post-Frasier, Williams has done a bit of "that guy who was in that thing" acting, as well as numerous movie releases, both theatrical and made for TV. She also had a brief recurring role on the Showtime series Dexter. After their call, we get our only Roz scene for this episode, where she talks about her date, and it turns out she dates interesting men. This really isn't surprising, and makes me really want a Roz-centric episode. At this point in time, she reminds me a lot of a more put-together Rebecca Howe. I loved Christy Alley in Cheers, and for me, the point where she came in and Shelley Long left was the true turning point from a good to great series. Peri Gilpin is so much more expressive than Christy Alley, and her smirks at Frasier have me cracking up every time. Niles shows up at the radio station for the first time this episode. Again, he doesn't remember who Roz is, and some funny banter about Roz's career comes out. Niles came to tell Frasier the lecture they'd been planning on attending that evening was cancelled, and it was a shame because Niles has a great Al Gore joke lined up for it. This kind of caught me off guard, as I tend to forget Al Gore was politically active in the 90s. Today, Gore is probably best known for losing an election to George Bush, his global warming activism, he's really serial, guys, and inventing the internet.
I took the initiative in creating the internet.
In 1993, Gore would have been best known for running for president in 1988 and accepting the role of Clinton's vice president in 1992, before being sworn in 1993. At the point in 1993 when this episode aired, it seems Gore was having a bit of a feud with Hillary Clinton over whose role was whose in the White House. So I'm guessing Niles' joke would have had something to do with that. After this, the brothers end up in a new location, a restaurant named Anya's Cafe. It doesn't look as classy as a coffee shop, but it looks nice enough. My hat's off to Eberhard's script here. There were 2 different points where I thought, that doesn't make sense, only to have my concern rectified in the script a few minutes later. The first is in Anya's Cafe. The brothers catch the tail end of what appears to be a dinner date with their father and a woman they knew from childhood named Marion. At this point, I was scratching my head in confusion. The fact that Martin was in the same restaurant as Niles and Frasier didn't make sense. Both brothers made it abundantly clear in episode 3 they think any restaurant their dad would eat in is not up to snuff. A minute later, Niles comments that the restaurant must not be as nice as he thought it was, since their dad was eating there, allowing me to breathe a sigh of relief as that crisis was averted. The woman Martin is eating with is Marion Lawler, an old family friend of Martin's. She is played by Pat Crowley. Crowley is a "that girl who was in that thing" actress, and stayed so for nearly 60 years. She began work in 1950 and continued to regularly appear as a guest star in you name it until the early 2000s. She's still alive today and turns 90 next month. She's been in classics from the Rockford Files to the original Twilight Zone to Charlie's Angels. Before she retired from acting in 2012, she did a 251 episode stint on the General Hospital spinoff Port Charles and 4 episodes of The Bold and the Beautiful, which Arcot from episode 4 also spent some time on. Crowley does fine in the role here, and shows why she was able to keep getting roles for 60 years. My one complaint with this whole plotline has nothing to do with her, or even the writing team really. It's just one of those sitcom things. But in episode 5, Here's Looking at You, Martin met and was dating a woman named Irene. It seems like she's already been completely forgotten about here. And I have a bad feeling that's going to be one of those tiny dangling plot lines that just never gets picked back up. The new Eddie jokes keep coming with this episode, and I love it. It doesn't look like there's anything about Moose's trainers on the DVD special features, but I'm going to try to track down more about them for a future episode. The dog is so well behaved, I find it easy to forget he's an actor, and not just on the set. Despite being a very Roz-light episode, I think this might be the most Daphne-heavy episode we've had thus far. After the pilot, I was really excited to see more of Daphne. But since then, outside of the cold case plotline with Martin, she hasn't had a whole lot to do. We get to see her being a bit more devious here, and even threatening Martin for a minute. As a nice change of pace for her character, and I hope to see more of it in upcoming episodes. Outside of perpetually not knowing who Roz is, Niles is actually on his best behavior in this episode. He has one of his longest scenes with Daphne to date, and he hardly flirts with her. He does give her a good long sniff though when she's not paying attention. With the Christmas card plotline last week, it felt like Daphne was becoming close to part of the family. In this episode, it becomes abundantly clear she isn't. When the Crane brothers question their father about infidelity in their family, Daphne is sent away and not welcome to be part of that conversation. The revelations from Martin's conversation lead to the second moment I had questions about. My doubts here will be resolved at the end of the episode. In Cheers, when Lilith cheated on Frasier, it was handled well, and you really felt bad for Frasier. Considering it probably happened within the last year or so of Frasier's life, give or take, I expected him to say something about it, and be more upset with his father. He does end up talking to him about it. Given the twist ending here, when he does get to it, I was actually glad he waited. It's really nice the father and son finally have something to bond over, even if it is something as sad as infidelity from their wives. From a design perspective, we get a new shot of the coffee shop, which is called Cafe Nervosa, by the way. This is the inner corner and surrounded by bookshelves. While Frasier and Niles talk here, Niles talks about his Healing with Humor seminar. He mentions he's going to wear oversized shoes, quick-release suspenders, and large polka dot boxers. Frasier did the same thing in an episode of Cheers, Season 7, Episode 9, Send in the Cranes, where he worked briefly as a party clown, except he forgot to wear the polka dot boxers. For me, the low point of this episode is the coda scene. It's fine, don't get me wrong, but it's just a repeat of Eddie's earlier joke, and it feels incredibly similar to the coda scene from the pilot episode, where the camera panned across the room to show everyone sleeping in front of the TV. It's not bad by any means, but given how great the last couple have been, it is a bit of a letdown. I have a couple other brief callouts I want to make for this episode. You may have noticed Martin calls Daphne Nurse Ratched when she's torturing him for information. I think this is a pretty well-known reference, but for those that don't know, Nurse Ratched is the nurse from the Jack Nicholson Louise Fletcher Best Picture winner, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It was also made into a Bates Motel-style prequel a few years ago, starring Sarah Paulson and showrun by Ryan Murphy. That show was just called Ratched. I didn't actually watch it, but Paulson is generally a good actress, and even at his worst, Ryan Murphy usually makes a watchable show. Holy ties, Batman! Frasier rocks a record-breaking 4 ties this episode, while Niles wears 3. Despite Frasier wearing 4 different ties this episode, only one of them is new. The first tie is a Thanksgiving tie, seen in several episodes so far. The second tie, with its busy white and blue diamond pattern, was last seen in episode 6. and this tie with its full gold pattern was seen in episode 3. This nice plain stripe tie is the only one new to this episode for Frasier. Out of Niles' 3 ties in this episode, 2 of them are new. The repeat is the yellow olive design, which he's worn several times, most recently last episode. Out of the other 2 ties, I want to point out the first one, as this is the first purple tie we've seen in the series. Excluding duplicate ties, we are a total of 16 ties for Frasier and 14 for Niles, giving us an average of 1 7/8 new ties per episode. It's nice to see Frasier still dealing with the emotional ramifications of Lilith's affair. It is also great to see a little more into Roz's dating life, and Daphne being maniacal and self-serving. For an episode with such heavy subject matter, Eberhard's script manages to find just the right balance of humor and character moments, and reverence for the topic covered in this character-building episode. If you like the father, and you like the son, give this 8 out of 10 episode of Frasier a watch.